I was often the only female at the table. And when I was very young, I just wanted to make sure that everybody thought I was smart enough to be there. It was not until I got further along in my career that I realized, okay, this is so wrong, and began focusing much more on how we diversified the people who actually were running whatever organization it was. And I've tried to bring along a lot of young women who have worked with me over the years. And it's actually one of the things that I take most pride in, that there are a lot of people who started their career working for me who are doing really interesting things right now.
Yeah, so forming a network has often been a really critical part of promoting diversity. What do you think has stood in the way in the past from underrepresented minorities or women from forming as strong professional networks?
That's a really good question. I think that it's easy to talk about those things and assume you can do it by yourself, but most of the time, it really takes some organized group of people or organizations that allow you to come together and actually form those kind of lasting networks. If you really look at the club structure in a city like New York, at the way that relationships have been formed for, I would say, centuries in this country, it's often been structured around white males. And for the white males in this room, congratulations, but the world is changing. And hopefully there will be many, many new organizations that enable people to get ahead because they have developed the kind of lasting relationships that end up giving you an early heads up on an opening at some company you're interested in, or help you to find the right person for a partnership, or help you to close a deal at a key moment. And I would mention a couple of them. I mean, you probably know organizations like Time's Up and All Raise. Do you know All Raise? Have you guys read about All Raise? It's an organization of women venture capitalists that was started out in San Francisco. VC is a critical part of the financial world that gets not enough attention. If you look at all the companies that went public since 1974, well over 45% of them were backed by venture capital. So it's a critical piece of the growth economy, and it's a very important generator of new wealth. So it is also dominated by white males still. 92% of all the investment partners in venture capital are still men. And the vast majority of those are not men of color. So All Raise was started about 18 months ago by a group of female VCs to double the number of investment partners in the next 5 years and to double the amount of capital going to female entrepreneurs. I will mention one other organization that you all should be aware of that was actually started by my partner, called #BuiltByGirls, and now Built by Girls Wave, which is a matching program for high school and college women to connect them with young professionals in the technology industry. So largely to allow women to begin to build their first network. You get matched with someone at one of the partner companies, Amazon, Spotify, Snap, Oath. There are a dozen very interesting companies that are partners on this. And you meet with your advisee once a month for an hour, and they promise to make 2 introductions for you. So over the course of a year, you end up with 12 connections in the tech industry, and a much better understanding of what's possible, what kind of careers exist, and hopefully an internship or 2 that will allow you to get ahead. Now you guys are at Princeton, so you have a leg up on a lot of the people who are trying to get into that industry, but I still think that creating that network is critically important.
Mm-hmm. And so you've spoken a lot about a variety of initiatives that have been started around diversity. Mm-hmm. Are there any ideas around diversity or movements that you'd really like to see that you're not seeing happening right now to promote diversity within corporations, within startups, within investing?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that exists is that unless you have buy-in at the very top of companies, unless the CEO is personally committed to this, they tend to fail. I would say if you care about this, think hard about the company you're joining, do the homework you need to do to figure out whether the CEO genuinely cares about this. That's what it's going to take over time for there to be real change.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, have you seen throughout the course of your career changes to diversity that have affected the way that a business technology industry has been operating, both in the sense of products and the sense of the culture and environment?
Yeah, so I actually saw a documentary film that I participated in too a couple of nights ago called This Changes Everything, that is about the ACLU action that was taken on behalf of women directors because it was very, very clear that women were being essentially kept out of directing jobs. Whether it was for Hollywood films or it was for television series. Staggeringly few women were getting these jobs, and they were getting stonewalled by the Directors Guild and by the major agencies who were really incentivized not to change things. Male directors were getting paid more, and they were being paid to direct bigger box office movies. And so that's where the agencies were all focusing their attention. The ACLU brought all of this to the EEOC, and the EEOC opened an investigation. And like many things, it took a legal decision to force any kind of change, but it has definitely had an impact, and we'll see. This is fairly recent, so we'll see over the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years whether it has a really dramatic impact on the kinds of films and the kinds of voices that get heard.
Do you think that it's going to take government action, political action, or legal action in order to really increase the amount of diversity within these kinds of industries?
I think change is slow without that. So you also all probably know about California's recent decision to mandate that there must be at least one female on every public board. Those things tend to have a quicker impact. The problem when you do that, however, is that people are often doing it for the wrong reasons. They figure, okay, we got to have our woman. We're going to find her. Let's find somebody who can chair the audit committee, and we'll will use her well. So it's not necessarily going to drive the kind of change I think I'd like to see, and I would imagine a lot of people in this room would like to see, but it's a start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so in your move from the corporate world to the world of investment, how did that change in career position alter the way that you saw diversity in the workplace?
So let me step back a little bit. I never thought I would be doing this. This is not something that I had as part of my plan. You can tell from my experience. I started out in magazines, I went into television, I saw myself as a creative person, and I became a CEO largely to have more control. When I was at Gilt, this is now 2008, 2009, 2010, I started seeing a phenomenon that I had not seen before, and that was that there were a whole lot of young women who were starting companies to solve consumer problems. And there were a few things that had happened in the world that I think drove that. One was that technology had advanced enough to allow somebody to launch a product and at least test market fit without having back-end engineers. So when that happened, it opened the door to a much broader set of entrepreneurs or founders than existed before. And all of them had the same story about how difficult it was to raise money. As I said, the venture capital world is still highly male, so they would all talk about going into rooms where there were 6, 8 guys around a conference table, and they would have to explain how women think about X or Y before they could start to explain the business they were building. And these were companies that have turned out to be really successful ventures: Rent the Runway, Birchbox, Paperless Post, LearnVest, The Skim, and all of them had trouble getting those first checks. So to me, that felt like both a need, but also a huge opportunity, because if we could back the best of these female entrepreneurs, who the rest of the venture capital world was either ignoring or didn't think a whole lot about, then we could probably get a good return. And that's what drove me into it. It was seeing an opportunity that was not being picked up by other people, and recognizing that there was a big need there.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that change within diversity can come not just from the top then, but also from people who recognize these kinds of opportunities?
Yes, no question. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. We're seeing a whole lot more micro funds, and this is my industry now, right? We're seeing a whole lot of new micro funds that are launching that are really focused on a different kind of founder, not a Mark Zuckerberg clone, but are focused on founders of color or focused on female founders. And it's all recognizing that if you are building a business for someone or some set of people, it really is a competitive advantage if you understand intuitively what they need, how they think about something, where to find them, how to talk to them. So yes, I think there will be more of that going forward.
Do you think that it will take a generational change in terms of our leadership in order to bring those diversity efforts into the mainstream, into the largest venture capital funds in the country, into the largest corporations in the country?
Yeah, I think that that what will probably happen is what I've seen over and over again, is that change is slow until it's fast, right? And you can see that with many things over the past decade, where there was incremental change. We see it around gay marriage, right? It felt like it was decades away until it gained enough momentum suddenly roll. And I think that's probably the case here, where a new generation that kind of takes diversity for granted, or certainly understands significantly better why it's important, will increasingly get into positions of power, and suddenly the change will happen much faster. But I do think there's going to be change along the way. We're seeing it now. I see it in my industry. There have been probably a dozen of the top VC firms that had no female partners a year ago have all added a female partner. That's largely not because they think, wow, this would be a really nice thing to do, but it's because Stitch Fix went public and because Eventbrite went public, both with female founders, and there are another half dozen companies that that will go public very soon, also with female founders, and it's largely FOMO that has gotten them to add a female partner.
Many of us in this room will soon be entering industries where at perhaps the analyst or entry level there is quite a bit of diversity, but within leadership there just isn't.
Yeah.
What advice might you have for someone entering that kind of environment, especially coming from your background in the entertainment industry?
Yeah, so I would say find your posse early. I think the thing that is usually soul crushing at companies like this is to be the only one, or to feel like you are alone. So identifying people who want to take that journey with you, I think is incredibly valuable. And it's also something to think about when you're deciding where you're going to work. What does it look like? I think too, taking advantage of whatever organizational structure there is that has been set up to make sure that the playing field is level, at least in terms of training and early experience. And the third thing I'd say is put your hand up for everything, because don't expect that somebody's going to realize how good you are and how smart you are. The major reason that I have been able to do what I've done over the course of my career is that I said yes to things. And often things that I wasn't sure I was going to succeed at. I didn't necessarily have all the background that was needed to make a leap from this industry to that industry. But my instinct has always been to take a chance on myself. And I think that as long as you're clear with the people you're going to work with, that this is what you bring to the party, this is what you're good at, and this is what they're going to need to help you with, there's a lot of goodwill out there. But raise your hand.
I'd like to take this opportunity to turn it over to any questions from students in the audience.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Thank you for speaking to us. Actually, I wanted to ask, you told us that men kind of dominate women in the arena of finance and investment banking. So I wanted to know some of the barriers that women face exclusively, like not with regards to men, but the women face, and what you faced while you were trying to, transit into this particular industry. Thank you.
I think I understand the question. What are the barriers I faced and that I think women in general face in the finance industry, the investment industry, and the other industries I've worked in? Yes?
What makes it hard? Thank you.
I think some of them are external, and I think some of them are internal. I think Sheryl Sandberg was right on Lean In that women, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I'll say women, that we think a lot about what our lives may become 2-3 years out, and I'm really talking about family responsibilities. It's hard to balance having kids and having a big job. I can tell you that. I've got 2 daughters and 2 stepdaughters. I would not trade it for anything in the world. But there were plenty of nights when I literally cried myself to sleep because I hadn't been able to see my kids that day. So I think there are special issues women face that guys don't, even though there are more men who are now taking over primary responsibility for child raising. It's still a fraction. So I think there's that. But I think there's also the boys' club at most of these companies is still real. And there is definitely a sense that if you don't go on the golf trip and if you aren't hanging out after work and having a couple of drinks, that you're not going to get that next promotion. And there are a ton of women I know who will tell you that they produced better work, they brought in better clients, et cetera, and yet the guy over here ended up getting promoted to director instead of them because he hung out with their boss. And so I think that creating those kind of networks while you are still, very new in companies where there are still a lot of women who are part of the team is really important, because ultimately, if you don't have your posse, as I said, your group that is going to help sponsor you through manager level, director level, VP, and on, it's unfair. Hi.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for speaking to us today. I wanted to ask you a question about the changing dynamics of the workplace. So there's the Impact Challenge that presented earlier today. And one of the great things that they said is that we need to be able to see people in positions of leadership that reflect the population and the society that we're moving towards. Right. But one of the things that, especially as a young woman of color, I think about frequently is the concept of tokenization in the workplace. While we may have more powerful people of color or women of color, that does not necessarily negate the impact of not having our voices be heard and represented in these places. And so I wanted to know, how did you manage that as a young person yourself working up in the industry, and what advice do you have for people like us who are hoping to be in positions of power one day?
I think that that you have to, while you're not going to accept the fact that it's a token situation, you have to put that aside, right? Because ultimately, if you get too angry personally about that so that you don't want to play anymore, that's not going to solve the problem. There is going to be a period of time where there are too few women of color that you see at whatever company you go into, and it feels wrong, and it feels like the ones who have been promoted have gotten there because they're extraordinary as opposed to just very good at their jobs. And so I would say be cognizant of it, make sure that you make other people aware of it at the same time, but don't let it paralyze you, and keep moving towards whatever your goal is, assuming that you have all the qualities you need in order to succeed, and make sure that you are building relationships along the way that are going to help you make that next move.
Hey Susan, my name is Martha. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I'm actually a brand ambassador for Built by Girls, so it was like awesome to hear you talk about it. Working in the tech industry, studying a technical degree, I think there's tons of challenges like inappropriate questions, harassment, like feeling underestimated. So in these environments, a lot of times I feel like there's a lot to get women in like tech, but there's not a lot happening to like retain women in tech. I mean, working for 6 months, like a year. What do you think? How can we make these environments more welcoming to women and like encourage women to stay in these environments as well?
There are a lot of people working on that. I think that that again, this goes back to making sure there are enough women on a team that they don't feel isolated, they don't feel like they are the other in the room. And while there have been more women hired into engineering positions and product management, it is still a dominantly male culture and sometimes not a friendly one. You've seen employees at places like Google speak out about how unfair it is that they have to work with women. So again, I would look hard at the company you're joining and try to make sure that there is a genuine effort underway to not only recruit women but also to keep them there, and that they've created connective tissue for the women who do work at that company if they are still the strong minority in almost every tech department, then finding ways to make sure they get together on a weekly or monthly basis so they can feel like, again, they have a support system. That's the key part of this. There are two things, right? One is that you want to feel like it's a level playing field for you to get promoted on a team. If you are one or two of 20 engineers on a team, you don't want to feel like there are 18 people ahead of you who are going to get promoted first. So making sure you understand what they're going to be looking for when they do make those decisions, that it is quantified and it's not just, well, you know, he's a good dude and we think he's really talented and we're gonna promote him, but that, you know, there are very specific things that they're gonna look to you to accomplish in order to decide you've got some leadership capabilities. And secondly, that there's a support system that's going to allow you to thrive. And by the way, if there isn't, you can start it. So that's the other thing I would say is don't wait for somebody else to do this. If you look at why employee research groups or resource groups have been set up at most companies over the past decade, it's largely because one person put their hand up and said, we need this.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. So I wanted to talk about, like you might already be aware, a lot of companies have now started implementing working remotely, working from home, working virtually. Yep. So that has allowed a lot of women to be prioritizing their career and actually start working. But like you said, the guy who sat with the boss got the promotion. So one way or another, even when women are trying to be a part of the office setting and trying to prioritize their career, they're still missing out on that interaction and on those chances. So So would you say that that is, even though it is a step forward, would you say we are at least like coming shoulder to shoulder with the norm that was there like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, with guys always being prioritized over women? And how can we counteract this notion that if you're working from home, it's not as effective as working from the office, even though our quality of performance is equal?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's always going to be challenging because you don't have the same one-to-one time usually with whoever your manager is. I would try to set up something like that if you are working remotely. Try to figure out how you're going to get measured on a quarterly basis, and often that's a one-on-one with whoever your manager is, where you set goals at the beginning of the quarter and you're expected to meet them, and at the end of the quarter you get another one-on-one to assess whether you met that or not. Unfortunately, a lot of the remote jobs that exist right now are looked at as not as a stepping stone into a bigger job, but as a way for a company to get certain things done without bringing someone into the home office. So there isn't the same career track often with a remote job. I will say that's changing some, particularly in the startup world, where companies will frequently have totally remote teams or dispersed teams, and so you'll have the entire C-suite in different cities, and that can, over time, I think, make a difference in how people think about remote work. But at big companies, it's still looked at primarily as work that is done by an individual contributor or somebody who is filling a role that they no longer have to have an FTE for. So again, if you're going to do that, then I would do everything I could to make sure that I get the same set of goals and the same review structure that everybody else is getting.
Unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be our last question today. Thank you so much for coming, Susan.
Thank you.